the other half. Jessica and Mark were high school sweethearts who got married right after graduation. Though they came from different backgrounds, Jessica's family was poor while Mark's was wealthy. Their love seemed able to conquer any obstacle, at least at first. Shortly after their wedding, Mark got a job opportunity across the country that was too good to pass up. Jessica didn't want to leave her family and friends, so they decided Mark would go ahead first and Jessica would join him in a few months. The night before Mark left, they held each other tightly, neither wanting to let go. "I'm going to miss you so much," Jessica whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "Me too, but it won't be for long," Mark reassured her. "Just a few months and we'll be together again." He kissed her tenderly before reluctantly pulling away to finish packing. Jessica helped Mark load up the car early the next morning. She waited with him at the terminal, savoring every last moment before he had to board his flight. "I love you," Mark said earnestly, caressing her cheek. "I love you too," Jessica choked out, trying not to cry. She watched Mark's plane take off, her heart sinking. The next few months without him would be difficult, but she found comfort knowing they'd be reunited soon. Jessica and Mark called and texted each other constantly over the months apart. She lived for their daily video chats, seeing Mark's face and hearing his voice. They talked about everything from their days to their hopes and dreams. It made the distance between them feel a little smaller. "Just a few more weeks," Mark reminded her each time, "then you'll be here with me." Jessica clung to that promise, counting down the days. She imagined how good it would feel to be wrapped in Mark's strong arms again. All her loneliness and longing would disappear once they were finally together. The morning Jessica was set to fly out to Mark, she could barely contain her excitement. Her bags were packed and waiting by the door. She kept glancing at the clock, willing time to go faster. Jessica's mom came by to see her off. "Have a safe flight," she said, giving Jessica a tight hug. "Give Mark my love." "I will, Mom," Jessica said. "I'll call you once I'm there." After another round of hugs, Jessica grabbed her bags and headed out the door. She was one step closer to Mark and starting their new life together. At the airport, Jessica breezed through check-in and security, too eager to feel any stress. She settled into her seat on the plane, leg bouncing with anticipation. Soon this separation would all be over. As the plane lifted into the sky, Jessica gazed out the window. She felt closer to Mark already. In just a few short hours, she would be back in his arms. She could hardly wait. About halfway through the flight, they hit some turbulence. Jessica gripped her armrests as the plane shook and jolted. She saw a flash of bright light outside her window, followed by a strange popping sound in her ears. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on and a few passengers cried out nervously, but after a minute the turbulence passed. Jessica let out a breath, her heart still pounding. She was thankful when the captain announced they'd begun their descent. Once the plane landed smoothly at the airport, Jessica leapt from her seat. She was dizzy with excitement as she hurried off the plane, scanning the crowds for Mark. At last, she spotted him beaming and waving. Jessica broke into a run, dropping her bag as she flung her arms around his neck. "I'm here!" she exclaimed joyously. She expected Mark to hug her back just as tightly, but instead he remained stiff, giving her a few hesitant pats on the back. Jessica pulled away, frowning. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, just a long day," Mark muttered, not quite meeting her gaze. "Let's get home." Jessica felt a twinge of hurt and confusion as they drove to Mark's new apartment. Why wasn't he more excited to see her? She tried telling him about the flight and her family back home, but his responses were clipped and distracted. Arriving at the apartment, Jessica tried to shake off her unease. Mark gave her a brief tour, acting almost like a polite stranger instead of her husband. He went to take a shower, leaving Jessica standing alone and lost in the unfamiliar rooms. This wasn't the reunion she had desperately dreamed of over the past few months. Why was Mark suddenly so cold and distant? At dinner that night, Jessica searched Mark's face for answers. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. "You seem different." Mark's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean. I'm still me. It's just, well, I imagined you'd be as excited to see me as I am to see you," Jessica said hesitantly. "But since I got here, you've been acting so distant." "Don't be ridiculous," Mark snapped. "I'm just the same as I've always been. Maybe you're the one who's changed." Jessica recoiled like she'd been slapped. "How can you say that? I love you, Mark. I'm still me." Mark's expression softened marginally. "I'm sorry, you're right. It's been a long day for both of us. Things will be better tomorrow once we've rested." But the next day was much the same. Mark responded to Jessica's affection with indifference and irritation. He avoided her gaze and touch, spending most of his time on the computer or watching TV. Jessica's hurt gave way to frustration. On the third night, she confronted him again. "Why won't you talk to me?" she cried. "Clearly something is wrong here. Tell me what I did so I can fix it." Mark turned his cold stare on her. "You want the truth? Fine. I'm not Mark. Not the Mark you knew back home." Jessica stared at him, sure she'd misheard. "What do you mean?" Not Mark smiled without any warmth. "There are forces in this universe you can't comprehend. When your plane passed through one of our portals, the real Mark and I traded places. He still thinks he's with you back home." The room seemed to spin. Jessica's chest tightened, breaths coming in panicked gasps. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "I assure you it's very serious." Not Mark said calmly. "We have the power to take on any form. The man you loved is gone." Jessica's legs buckled and she sank to the floor as harsh sobs racked her body. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare she would wake from. The real Mark was waiting for her back home. Not Mark watched her cry with a clinical detachment. He clearly had no empathy or love for her. Inside this perfect replica was a cruel, inhuman being. "Please," Jessica choked out. "I need to get back to my real husband." Something dangerous flashed in Not Mark's eyes. "You're not going anywhere. He belongs to us now, his essence replaced with one of our own. But you..." His cold smile returned. "I think I'll keep you." Revulsion shot through Jessica. She had to escape this monster wearing her husband's beloved face. When he was in the shower, she crept out of the apartment with her bag and fled into the night. She had no plan, just a desperate need to get away. Jessica wandered the dark, unfamiliar streets aimlessly. Exhaustion and despair crept over her, but she was too afraid to stop. She had to keep moving or risk Not Mark finding her again. After what felt like hours, she came across a seedy-looking motel. Jessica hesitated, then decided she needed rest, even if the place gave her chills. At least Not Mark didn't know where she was. The clerk leered as Jessica paid for a room. She avoided his slimy gaze, quickly taking the key and rushing off to her room. After locking the door, she collapsed onto the lumpy mattress and finally gave in to her anguish. She sobbed until she had no tears left, her mind spinning with questions. Was the Mark back home even the real Mark, or had he been replaced too? Would she ever see her husband again? Exhausted, Jessica eventually drifted off into a fitful sleep, but she awoke sometime later to the sound of her doorknob rattling. Heart pounding. She cowered under the covers, praying it was just her imagination. Then came a loud bang as the door nearly splintered under a heavy force. Not Mark's terrible face appeared in the doorway, flickering through monstrous shapes. "Thought you could escape?" he snarled, advancing on Jessica's frozen form. "I'll never let you go." Jessica's screams died in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, silently pleading to wake up from this hellish nightmare. But when she opened them again, the alien impersonating Mark still loomed over her. He grabbed her roughly by the arm, hissing vicious threats in a strange language. His grip was inhumanly strong, fingernails digging into her skin. Jessica sobbed helplessly, certain he meant to kill her or worse. Just when she thought she couldn't bear another second, Not Mark cried out in pain, releasing her. Jessica's eyes flew open to see the motel clerk wrestling the creature away from her. "Get out of here," the clerk yelled. "I'll hold it off." Jessica hesitated only a second before fleeing from the room. She ran through the parking lot blindly, no idea where she was heading. Her only thought was to get as far away as possible. She ended up at an all-night diner, huddling in a booth and trying to calm her frantic breathing. The other patrons cast curious glances her way, but thankfully kept their distance. When the waitress came over, Jessica ordered coffee with shaking hands. She had no money or plan. All her belongings were back in that motel room, if not Mark hadn't destroyed them already. The bell on the door jingled, making Jessica jump. Her heart stopped when she saw two police officers enter the diner. She was about to be arrested for skipping out on her room. But to her shock, the officers walked right over to her booth. "Ma'am, we're looking for Jessica Liddell," one said. "That's you, right?" Jessica nodded mutely, unable to find her voice. The officer's expression turned sympathetic. "There's no easy way to tell you this, but your motel room caught fire overnight. I'm very sorry, but your husband didn't make it out." For a moment, Jessica just blinked, certain she'd misheard. Not Mark was dead? It seemed too good to be true. The officers gently explained that the clerk saw flames and smoke coming from her room and called 911. By the time firefighters arrived, the whole room was engulfed. Not Mark's charred remains were found inside. "We know this is a lot to process," the officer said. "Let us drive you to the station where we can talk more." Still in shock, Jessica let herself be led to their cruiser. As they drove, she gazed out at the city bathed in dawn's light. She had survived the long night. The monster was gone for good, but her real husband was still lost, somehow replaced by one of those things. At the station, they gave Jessica food, water, and a blanket before starting their questions. She told them everything, no longer caring how insane it sounded. It felt good to finally say it all out loud. The officers listened politely, though Jessica could tell they didn't believe her. In their eyes, she was just a widow in shock, unable to accept her husband's accidental death. They assumed the story about aliens was her mind's way of coping, so Jessica quickly stopped trying to convince them. They wouldn't understand until those creatures came for them too. She agreed to let Mark's family handle funeral arrangements, not having the emotional strength to do it herself. The officers gave their condolences, assuring her this terrible accident wasn't her fault. But Jessica knew the truth. Not Mark had died trying to keep her prisoner. After giving her statement, the officers said she was free to go. "Do you have someone you can call to pick you up?" one asked. Jessica thought of her parents back home. As painful as it would be, she needed their comfort and familiarity right now. Once she was alone, Jessica dialed her childhood home. The phone rang several times before her dad finally answered, his voice hoarse. "Jessica, is that you?" "Dad," she sobbed, "can you come get me?" He went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone held a strange edge. "What are you talking about, Jessica? You're already here." A chill ran down her spine. No, it wasn't possible. "Who is this?" she demanded, gripping the phone tightly. "It's your father," he said firmly. "Now tell me what's going on." Jessica slammed the phone down, breathing hard. She stared at the black mirror of the screen, a new nightmare dawning. Her family back home thought everything was normal, which could only mean one thing. They weren't her real family. Those creatures had already invaded her hometown and taken their places. Nowhere was safe. Bile rose in Jessica's throat as the weight of her impossible situation crashed down. She was completely alone, everyone she loved replaced by monsters wearing their faces. Blindly, she stumbled from the station and started walking down the street. She had nowhere to go, no one left to turn to. The world she knew had been ruthlessly ripped away. Lost in her spiral of despair, Jessica was unaware of the car speeding towards her until tires squealed. In the split second before impact, she felt an odd sense of peace. At least now she would be free from this living hell. But instead of breaking bones, she passed straight through the car and out the other side, landing in a heap on the asphalt. There was no pain, only confusion. How was she still alive? Trembling, Jessica got to her feet. The car had come to a halt down the block, the driver staring back at her in shock. Jessica looked down at her hands, watching them turn translucent, then fade from sight altogether. That's when she realized the truth. She hadn't survived the crash. Her spirit was now unbound from its physical form. She was dead, a ghost drifting helplessly in a world of monsters. This grim revelation threatened to destroy Jessica's last shred of sanity. She clutched her head, willing herself to wake up from this ceaseless nightmare. It couldn't end like this. Then she remembered the flash of light on the plane, the sound that popped her ears. That's when the real Mark had been taken and replaced. If she could somehow get back there, maybe she could warn him before it happened. Jessica raced back to the airport, no longer constrained by physical limits. She passed straight through the walls into the bustling terminals. None of the people milling about showed any sign of noticing the ghost in their midst. She made her way to the tarmac where planes were landing and taking off. Jessica's heart leapt when she saw the airline that had brought her to this fateful place. Right there was her portal back. As she stumbled through the turbulence baying inside the plane, Jessica prayed she wasn't too late. Jessica drifted through the aisles of the airplane, unseen by the passengers, absorbed in their books, movies, and snacks. She scanned each seat desperately for a familiar face. Where was he? Then she spotted him. Mark, her beloved husband, listening to music, unaware of the danger ahead. Jessica cried out his name joyously, but of course he didn't react. She took the seat next to Mark, studying his face. He looked just as she remembered. Not an imposter. Could she really save him from the same terrible fate she had suffered? Mark shifted, glancing around with a slight frown. For a heart-stopping moment, Jessica thought he had sensed her presence, but his gaze passed right through her, seeing nothing. Still, Jessica had to try reaching him. She leaned in close, whispering his name in his ear. Mark jerked, eyes widening. Jessica kept repeating his name more insistently. "Who's there?" Mark said under his breath. The woman in the next seat gave him an odd look. Jessica was so elated she could have wept. Somehow, in some small way, Mark could hear her. She just had to keep trying. She told him over and over that he was in danger, that he couldn't get off this plane. The flight had to be turned around and go back home. It was their only chance. Mark clutched his head, clearly unsettled. Jessica could tell her voice was getting through, stirring his subconscious, but it wasn't enough. She had to make him fully understand. In desperation, she attempted possessing his body, hoping she could control him directly. At first it seemed to work. His hands jerked and spasmed against his will. Yes, Jessica thought triumphantly. She tried urging him to stand, to yell and get the crew's attention, but after rising partway, Mark froze. His breathing turned ragged, beads of sweat dotting his brow. He sank back into his seat, face pale. "Stop," he rasped, so quiet only Jessica could hear. "Please." Horrified, she immediately released her hold on him. She hadn't meant to hurt Mark, only protect him. As a ghost, she kept forgetting her own ethereal strength. The plane began its descent, landing gear lowering. They were almost out of time. In desperation, Jessica solidified her form just long enough to hit the call button above Mark's seat. A flight attendant bustled over, giving Mark a polite smile. "Did you need something, sir?" Mark opened and closed his mouth wordlessly. The intercom dinged. "Folks, we are beginning our final descent into Chicago." "No," Jessica wailed. She couldn't let the plane land, but she was out of ideas. As the ground rushed up to meet them, Jessica felt her last hope dying. She had failed Mark. At the last second, Jessica saw Mark's face harden with resolve. "Emergency!" he suddenly yelled, leaping into the aisle. There's something wrong with this flight. You have to stop." Cries of alarm erupted as Mark blocked the flight attendant from getting by. He kept shouting desperately for them to turn around. The plane shook as engines screamed into reverse thrust. Passengers screamed, oxygen masks dropped from compartments. Slowly, agonizingly, the descent leveled off. Mark had done it. Jessica cried joyful tears even as attendants wrestled Mark into a seat. She stayed by his side as the plane circled back towards home, soaring into the clouds and away from that fateful portal. Mark was taken away once they touched down, doubtlessly to be psychologically evaluated, but he was safe. That was all that mattered to Jessica. She could rest peacefully now. As ghostly fatigue claimed her, she hovered close to Mark's ear one last time. "I love you," she whispered before fading away. "Be happy." Whether those words somehow reached him, Jessica didn't know. But she hoped beyond hope that Mark would move on from her and not be haunted as she was. They had defied the odds to steal one last moment together. It would have to be enough. With Mark saved, Jessica felt herself detach wholly from the physical plane. Her unfinished business was done. She surrendered to the peaceful darkness, letting it carry her far beyond the reach of monsters. The nightmare was finally over. Beware the darkness that lurks within the light. Not all is as it seems on the surface. Should that which you hold dear be spirited away, despair not, but tread carefully in the pursuit of restoration, lest ye awaken demons and find thyself utterly alone in their infernal domain. Heed this warning, for the veil is thin between realities, and sinister forces dwell in the shadows, hungry for the unwary soul. Keep loved ones close and your wits about you, or you may just find yourself trapped in a living nightmare from which there is no escape. Please like, share, and subscribe for more creepy tales from the netherworld. Thanks for your support. Until next time, sweet dreams.